Part 5. The Truth About Human Madness. The final session began differently than the others. HFY entered the tribunal chamber to find it packed beyond capacity. Word of his testimony had spread throughout the galactic capital, and representatives from dozens of species had requested permission to hear his conclusion. The mediator looked tired, as if she had spent the night reviewing everything he had told them. "Commander," she began, "this tribunal has heard testimony about tactics and capabilities that seem to violate everything we understand about civilized warfare. Before we conclude, we need you to help us understand what we're really dealing with." HFY nodded slowly. He had been preparing for this moment for 3 months, trying to find words that could explain the impossible truth he had discovered. "You want to know if humans are monsters," he said simply. The directness of the statement caused a stir throughout the chamber. Representatives whispered among themselves, clearly uncomfortable with such blunt language in an official proceeding. "Are they?" the mediator asked. "No, there's something much worse than monsters." The whispers stopped immediately. Every being in the chamber was now focused entirely on HFY. Monsters can be understood. Monsters have motivations that make sense: hunger, territory, revenge. You can predict what a monster will do because monsters follow patterns. HFY's voice was steady now, filled with the certainty of hard-won knowledge. Humans don't follow patterns. They follow instincts that are millions of years older than civilization. Explain what you mean. Every species in this chamber evolved as either predators or prey, but we all evolved on worlds where those roles were clearly defined. Predators hunted during specific seasons in specific territories for specific prey. Prey animals developed strategies to avoid or escape predation during those periods. The mediator nodded, following his logic. Humans evolved differently. They evolved as persistence hunters on a world where there were no rules. What do you mean by persistence hunters? It means they didn't evolve to be fast or strong, or to have natural weapons. They evolved to never stop, to follow their prey for days or weeks or months until that prey collapsed from exhaustion. HFY stood up from his chair and began pacing in front of the witness stand. The movement helped him organize his thoughts, helped him explain what he had learned through the most terrifying experience of his life. Every other predator in the galaxy evolved to make quick kills. Hunt, catch, eat, rest. Humans evolved to make slow kills. They would wound an animal and then follow it for days while it gradually weakened from blood loss and fatigue. But humans have been civilized for thousands of years. Surely they've moved beyond such primitive behaviors. Have they? HFY stopped pacing and faced the tribunal directly. "Let me tell you what I discovered about human warfare. Everything they did to us was completely normal for their species." "That seems impossible." "The night vision that allowed them to move in complete darkness, standard human biology. Every human has it. The ability to remain silent while moving through difficult terrain. They call it hunting skills and teach it to their children as recreational activities." The tribunal was silent now, listening with growing unease. The endurance that allowed them to run for 7 days without rest? Human long-distance runners compete in events that last for days. They do it for entertainment. What about the psychological tactics? The systematic terror campaign? They call it psychological warfare and have entire military academies dedicated to teaching it. But the techniques are based on hunting strategies their ancestors used for thousands of generations. HFY resumed pacing, his movements sharp and agitated. "The ability to track us through the desert, to anticipate our movements, to surround us without being detected. These are skills every human military unit practices regularly. They have a name for it: reconnaissance and surveillance." "And the violence at the refugee camp?" HFY's pacing stopped abruptly. "That was the most human thing of all." "How so?" "When humans perceive a threat to their young, they enter what their own scientists call protective aggression. It's a biological response that overrides rational thought and social conditioning. But the level of violence was extraordinary. Only by our standards. Humans evolved in small family groups where the survival of children was the primary genetic imperative. When their young are threatened, humans become capable of violence that other species can't even imagine." The mediator was taking notes rapidly now, trying to capture every detail of his explanation. The weapons improvisation, the apparent immunity to pain, the pack hunting behavior, all of this represents human biology functioning exactly as it evolved to function. Are you saying that humans are naturally violent? I'm saying that humans are naturally survivors. Violence is just one of many tools they use to ensure survival. Vexhai sat back down, suddenly feeling exhausted. The mistake we made was thinking that human civilization had changed their fundamental nature. What do you mean? We assumed that because humans had developed technology and joined galactic society, they had evolved beyond their primitive instincts. We thought they would fight wars the same way we do, with rules, with limited objectives, with respect for civilized behavior. But they don't? They can't. When humans feel threatened, millions of years of evolution take over. They stop being civilized beings and become what they always were, the most dangerous predators their planet ever produced. The tribunal chamber was completely silent. Representatives were staring at Vexhai with expressions ranging from fascination to horror. "Commander," the mediator said carefully, "are you suggesting that humans are inherently unsuited for galactic civilization?" "I'm suggesting that galactic civilization is inherently unsuited for humans." The statement hit the assembly like a physical blow. Several representatives began talking among themselves in urgent whispers. "Think about it," Vexhai continued. "Every species in this chamber developed concepts of warfare based on their evolutionary background. Prey species like the Zephyrians fight defensively, seeking to minimize casualties and end conflicts quickly. Pack predators like the Krell fight in organized groups with clear hierarchies and objectives. And humans? Humans fight like apex predators. They have no natural enemies, so they never learned when to stop fighting. They never developed concepts like acceptable losses or proportional response, because in their evolutionary environment, survival was binary. You either killed everything that threatened you, or you died." The mediator set down her stylus and looked directly at Vexhai. "What does this mean for future relations between humans and other galactic civilizations?" "It means we need to understand what we're dealing with. Humans aren't monsters or war criminals. They're just being human. But human nature is incompatible with everything we consider civilized behavior. Do you believe coexistence is possible?" Vexhai was quiet for a long moment, considering the question carefully. "I think it's possible, but only if we accept certain realities. Humans will never fight wars the way we do. They will never accept defeat the way we do. They will never respond to threats the way we do. What do you recommend? Never threaten human civilians. Never trap human military units with no escape route. Never assume that human forces will surrender when facing impossible odds." Vexhai's voice grew harder. "And never, ever make the mistake of thinking you can predict what humans will do when they feel their survival is at stake. Is that your final assessment?" "No. My final assessment is this. Humans aren't like us, and we need to stop pretending they are. They're predators who learn to build spaceships, but they're still predators. If we want to coexist with them, we need to understand their nature and respect their capabilities." The mediator nodded and made final notes. "This tribunal will now recess to consider the testimony we have heard." As the chamber began to empty, several representatives approached Vexhai directly. Their questions were all variations of the same theme. How do we protect ourselves from humans? How do we negotiate with a species that doesn't follow our rules? How do we maintain galactic peace when one member species has the capacity for unlimited violence? Vexhai answered each question the same way. You learn to live with predators the same way prey animals have always done. You don't provoke them, you don't threaten their young, and you never forget what they're capable of. The last representative to approach him was an elderly, Altarian diplomat who had been observing the proceedings from the back of the chamber. "Commander," she said quietly, "do you truly believe humans can be trusted as allies?" Vexhai thought about the question for several seconds before answering. "I believe humans can be trusted to be human. If you understand their nature and respect their instincts, they can be the most loyal allies in the galaxy. But if you betray them or threaten what they care about," he shrugged. "Well, you've heard my testimony." As the chamber finally emptied, Vexhai remained at the witness stand for several minutes, staring at his hands. They had finally stopped shaking. After 3 months of reliving the nightmare, he had found a way to make sense of it. Humans weren't evil. They weren't monsters. They were just the product of a different kind of evolution, shaped by a world where survival required capabilities that other species could barely comprehend. The cantina on Nexus Prime smelled of smoke and cheap alcohol. Strange beings from across the galaxy sat at metal tables, drinking and talking in hushed voices. In the darkest corner far from the main crowd sat a creature that made others look away when they passed by. Zethkar was hard to miss. even in the shadows. He stood nearly 8 feet tall with 4 powerful arms covered in thick dark scales. Where his eyes should have been, 2 red mechanical devices glowed softly in the dim light. Scars ran across his face and neck like a map of old battles. His people, the Vorthak, were known as fierce warriors. But Zethkar looked tired, older than his years. A young woman walked toward his table. She had pale blue skin and silver hair that marked her as one of the Centauri people. Her hand shook slightly as she approached, but her voice was steady when she spoke. "Excuse me," she said. "Are you Zethkar of the 7th Vorthak Legion?" The alien's mechanical eyes turned toward her. For a long moment he said nothing. Then he gestured to the empty chair across from him with one of his lower arms. "Sit," he said. His voice was deep and rough, like stones grinding together. "You are the journalist who has been asking questions about me." The woman sat down quickly. "My name is Lyra Vane. I work for the Galactic News Network. I wanted to ask you about your military service." Zethkar picked up his drink with one hand while another drummed on the table. "Many served in the war. Why talk to me?" "Because you fought against humans," Lyra said. "I'm writing about military tactics used by different species. The humans are still new to galactic warfare. I thought you could tell me how they fight." A sound came from Zethkar's throat that might have been laughter, but it held no joy. "How they fight?" He took a long drink. "Child, you ask dangerous questions. I don't understand." "The war ended 15 years ago," Zethkar said. "But it never really ended for those of us who faced humans in battle. You want to know about their tactics? Their weapons? Their ships?" Lyra nodded eagerly, pulling out a small recording device. Zethkar stared at the device for a moment. "Put that away. Some stories should not be recorded. They should only be spoken, person to person, so you can see the fear in the teller's eyes." Lyra hesitated, then put the recorder back in her bag. "Good," Zethkar said. "Now let me ask you something. What do you know about fear?" "Fear?" Lyra looked confused. "I suppose everyone feels fear sometimes." "No," Zethkar shook his head. "Not the fear of falling or of being hurt. I mean the deep fear that lives in your bones. The fear that makes strong warriors wake up screaming 15 years after a battle. The fear that makes entire fleets change course rather than face an enemy." He leaned forward, his mechanical eyes focusing on her face. "That is what humans bring to war. Not better weapons or faster ships, fear. But humans are small," Lyra said. "They're new to space. Most species are stronger or smarter or have better technology." "Yes," Zethkar agreed. "Humans are physically weak compared to my people. Their ships were often older than ours. Their weapons were sometimes less powerful. And yet..." He paused, looking around the cantina as if checking for listeners. "Do you know why I drink alone in dark corners?" he asked. "Why other veterans like me avoid crowded places?" Lyra shook her head. "Because we cannot stop watching for them," Zethkar said. "Even now, 15 years later, we watch for humans. Not because we hate them, because we learn to fear them in ways that go deeper than thought." "I still don't understand," Lyra said. "What makes them so frightening?" Zethkar was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was softer, almost whispering. "Other species fight for many reasons," he said. "Territory, resources, honor, revenge. These are things you can understand, things you can plan against. But humans fight for something else entirely." "What?" "Each other," Zethkar said simply. "They fight for each other with a fury that makes no military sense. A human soldier will throw away tactical advantage to save one comrade. They will hold impossible positions not for strategic value, but because retreating means abandoning someone they care about." He picked up his drink again but did not sip it. "You ask about their tactics," he continued. "Their tactics are insanity. They do things no reasonable military mind would attempt. And somehow it works. Can you give me an example?" Zethkar's mechanical eyes dimmed slightly. "I will tell you several stories. But understand this. I am not the only veteran with such tales. Across 17 star systems, warriors gather in dark places and share similar stories. We share them not as entertainment but as warnings. Warnings about what? About what happens when you underestimate humans," Zethkar said. "About what happens when you think their small size and short lifespans make them weak. About what happens when you forget that some species do not fight to win. They fight to protect." Lyra felt a chill run down her spine. "And there's a difference?" "All the difference in the galaxy," Zethkar said. "When you fight to win, You can accept loss if the cost becomes too high. When you fight to protect, there is no cost too high. There is no position you will not hold. There is no sacrifice you will not make. He finally took another drink, then set the glass down carefully. The coalition learned this lesson slowly, he said. We learned it battle by battle, defeat by defeat. We learned it as our fleets grew smaller and our warriors grew afraid to sleep. We learned it until our leaders had no choice but to beg for peace. You're saying humans won the war? No, Zethkar said, and his voice was grim. We won most of the battles. We took most of their territory. We destroyed most of their ships. But humans don't fight battles. They fight wars, and they don't fight wars to win. They fight wars so their children can live free. Lyra sat quietly, trying to process what she was hearing. I will tell you 3 stories, Zethkar said. 3 battles where I saw humans fight. After I finish, you will understand why veterans like me drink alone, and why the galaxy learned to fear a species that weighs half what we do and lives barely a century. He looked directly at her, his mechanical eyes glowing brighter. But I warn you now, once you hear these stories, you will never look at humans the same way again. You will see them in crowds and remember what they are capable of. You will watch them with their families and understand why we could never truly defeat them. I still want to hear them, Lyra said, though her voice was smaller now. Very well, Zethkar said. But remember, you asked for this knowledge, and some knowledge once gained cannot be forgotten. The cantina seemed to grow quieter around them, as if the very air was waiting to hear what would come next. Zethkar called for another drink before continuing his story. The cantina had grown quieter around them, as if other patrons sensed the weight of the conversation happening in the dark corner. 6 months after Chronos 7th, he began, I was transferred to a special investigation unit. Our job was to solve military mysteries, ships that vanished, bases that went silent, weapons that stopped working for no clear reason. He watched the bartender bring his drink, waiting until the server was gone before speaking again. The call came on a Tuesday morning, Zethkar said. The Coalition dreadnought Eternal Glory had stopped responding to all communications. This was not a small ship, you understand. 3 kilometers long, crew of 3,000, enough firepower to destroy a moon. What did you think had happened? Mechanical failure, perhaps, Zethkar replied. Or plague. Sometimes a virus would spread through a ship's life support system. We had seen it before. But when we boarded the Eternal Glory, we found something that made no sense at all. Lyra leaned forward. What? The ship was perfect, Zethkar said. Every system working normally. Lights on, air fresh, food still warm in the galley. The engines were humming quietly, ready for orders. Even the sleeping quarters were neat and tidy, as if the crew had just stepped out for a moment. But no crew? Not a single soul, Zethkar confirmed. 3,000 Coalition soldiers, officers, and technicians, gone. No bodies, no signs of struggle, no emergency messages. Just an empty ship floating in space like a ghost. He took a sip of his drink, his mechanical eyes reflecting the dim lights of the cantina. We searched every deck, every room, every storage compartment, he continued. Nothing. The weapon systems were armed and ready. The shields were at full power. The escape pods were all still in their bays. It was as if 3,000 people had simply decided to vanish into thin air. That's impossible, Lyra said. We thought so too, Zethkar agreed. So we checked the security recordings. Every ship keeps complete records of all activity for exactly this reason. What we found on those recordings changed everything we thought we knew about warfare. What did you see? Zethkar was quiet for a moment, staring into his drink. 12 humans, he said finally. 12 humans had somehow gotten aboard the ship 3 days before it went silent. Not soldiers in armor or commandos with weapons, just 12 ordinary-looking humans in simple clothes. How did they get past the ship's defenses? We never figured that out, Zethkar admitted. The recordings showed them already aboard, walking through the corridors as if they belonged there. They did not sneak or hide. They simply walked up to Coalition crew members and began talking to them. Talking? Conversations, Zethkar explained. Normal, friendly conversations. The humans would approach a group of soldiers and say hello. They would ask about their families, their homes, their hopes for the future. And somehow, impossibly, the Coalition crew would answer. Lyra frowned. That doesn't make sense. Why would soldiers talk to enemy infiltrators? Because the humans did not act like enemies, Zethkar said. They acted like friends, or maybe counselors. They listened when people talked. They asked thoughtful questions. They shared stories of their own families and homes. But surely the crew tried to capture them. You would think so, Zethkar said. But watch enough of those recordings and you begin to understand what happened. The humans did not threaten anyone. They did not demand surrender or make military demands. They simply talked about the war. What did they say? Zethkar's voice became softer, more thoughtful. They talked about the cost, he said. Not the cost in money or resources, but the cost in lives. They showed pictures of destroyed worlds, both human and coalition. They played recordings of children asking when their parents would come home. They shared letters from families who had lost sons and daughters in the fighting. Propaganda. No, Zethkar said firmly. Truth. Painful, honest truth about what the war was doing to everyone involved. They did not say the coalition was evil, or that humans were righteous. They simply showed the reality of what we were all part of. He paused to take another drink. On the second day, he continued, something strange began happening. Coalition crew members started seeking out the humans to talk to them. Not to capture them, but to ask questions, to share their own doubts and fears about the war. The humans were converting them? Not converting, Zethkar corrected. Listening. The humans spent most of their time just listening to people talk about their lives, their families, their reasons for fighting. And slowly, crew members began to realize something. What? That they were not so different from their enemies, Zethkar said. The humans would show a coalition soldier a picture of a destroyed human city, then ask the soldier to describe his own home. They would play a recording of a human child crying for her father, then ask if the soldier had children of his own. Lyra felt a chill of understanding. By the third day, Zethkar continued, the mood on the ship had completely changed. Crew members were talking to each other about the conversations they had with the humans. They were asking questions they had never asked before. Questions like, why are we really fighting? What will happen to our families if we die? Is there another way to solve this conflict? And then they made a choice, Zethkar said simply. Not all at once, but gradually throughout the day. One by one, crew members began walking to the escape pods. Not because they were ordered to, not because they were afraid, but because they no longer wanted to be part of the war. They abandoned their posts. They abandoned the war, Zethkar said. By evening, the ship was empty except for the 12 humans. And they left too, taking one of the smaller shuttles. They could have taken the entire dreadnought. But they did not want it. They just wanted to end the killing. Lyra sat in stunned silence. We found some of the crew later, Zethkar said. They had scattered to different systems, but many of them were living quiet lives on neutral worlds. When we questioned them, they all said the same thing, which was that the humans had not threatened them or brainwashed them. They had simply helped them remember why they were fighting and helped them realize that those reasons were not worth the cost anymore. Zethkar's mechanical eyes focused on Lyra's face. Do you understand what this means? He asked. 12 humans with no weapons and no threats convinced 3,000 trained soldiers to walk away from the war, not by defeating them in battle, but by talking to them like people instead of enemies. That's not possible. And yet it happened, Zethkar said, and it was not the only time. Similar incidents occurred throughout the war. Humans would somehow get close to coalition forces and simply talk to them, not about tactics or strategy, but about life, about families, about the future they wanted for their children. He finished his drink and set the glass down carefully. Other species fight for territory or resources or honor, he said. These things can be negotiated, compromised on, traded away. But humans fight for each other, for the right to exist peacefully with their families. And when they show other people what they are fighting for, it becomes very hard to want to destroy it. So the humans were using psychological warfare? No, Zethkar said firmly. They were using honesty. And honesty, it turns out, is the most powerful weapon in the galaxy, because once you truly understand what you are fighting against, it becomes very difficult to keep fighting. Lyra shook her head slowly. I don't know what to think about this. Neither did we, Zethkar said. But the effects were real. Word of the eternal glory spread through the coalition fleet, despite all attempts to keep it secret. Suddenly, every soldier was wondering what they would do if 12 humans walked up to them and started asking questions about their families. He looked around the cantina again, as if checking for threats that might not exist. That was when the coalition leadership began to understand, he said. We were not just fighting human soldiers. We were fighting human hearts and minds. And hearts and minds, it turns out, are much harder to defeat than ships and weapons. Zethkar's third drink arrived as he prepared to tell his final story. His mechanical eyes had grown dimmer, and Lyra noticed that his hands trembled slightly when he lifted the glass. "The last story is the hardest to tell," he said, "because it was the end of everything we thought we knew about war, about victory, about what it means to fight for survival." He stared at the wall behind Lyra for a long moment before continuing. 2 years after the Eternal Glory incident, Coalition High Command decided to end the war once and for all. They assembled the largest military force in galactic history. Over 300 ships, 2 million soldiers, weapons that could crack planets in half. The final assault on Earth? Yes, Zethkar confirmed. I was aboard the flagship as a senior tactical advisor. My job was to help plan the attack that would break human resistance forever. We called it Operation Final Dawn. His voice grew heavier with each word. The human home system had strong defenses, but nothing compared to our fleet. Their ships were outnumbered 3-1. Their weapons were older technology. Their soldiers were exhausted from 2 years of constant fighting. By every military calculation, the battle should have lasted 6 hours. How long did it actually last? 14 days, Zethkar said quietly. 14 days of the most brutal fighting the galaxy had ever seen. And by the end, even though we won the battle, we had lost the war. Lyra waited for him to continue. The fighting began normally enough, Zethkar said. Our ships advanced. Their ships met us at the edge of their system. Standard tactics, predictable movements. But as the battle progressed, we began to notice something strange. What? Human ships that should have retreated kept fighting. Vessels with critical damage to their engines, their weapons, their life support. They stayed in the battle. We would disable a human cruiser, assume it was finished, then find it still firing at us with whatever systems remained online. Zethkar took a sip of his drink, his hands steadying slightly. When their ships were finally destroyed, we expected the crews to surrender or evacuate. Instead, they did something we had never seen before. They would aim their escape pods at our ships and ram them at full speed. That's suicide. Yes, Zethkar agreed. But effective suicide. Some of those pods actually penetrated our hull armor. A few human survivors would crawl out with nothing but emergency tools and handheld weapons, trying to continue the fight inside our ships. That's insane. That's what we thought, Zethkar said. But it kept happening. Over and over throughout the battle. Humans who should have been dead or captured would find ways to keep fighting, not because they thought they could win, but because giving up was not possible for them. He paused, his mechanical eyes focusing on something Lyra could not see. On the 7th day of the battle, he continued, something changed. Every human ship, from the largest battle cruiser to the smallest fighter, began broadcasting the same message on all frequencies. What message? 4 words, Zethkar said. For our children's children's children. Lyra felt a chill run down her spine. They repeated it constantly, Zethkar continued. During attacks, during retreats, even when their ships were exploding around them. For our children's children's children. Over and over like a prayer or a promise. What did it mean? At first we thought it was a code, Zethkar explained. Our intelligence officers spent hours trying to decode some hidden military meaning. But gradually we realized there was no code. It meant exactly what it said. They were fighting for future generations. Not just fighting, Zethkar corrected. Dying. They were dying for people who had not even been born yet. For children they would never meet. Grandchildren they would never hold. They were sacrificing their lives so that humans 100 years in the future could live free. The weight of those words settled over the table like a heavy blanket. That was when our morale began to crack, Zethkar said. Coalition soldiers started asking questions. If humans were willing to die for children not yet born, what did that say about their determination? How do you defeat an enemy who fights not just for themselves but for generations to come? Did it affect the battle? Oh yes, Zethkar said grimly. Our advance slowed. Ship captains became hesitant to engage human forces directly, knowing that even victory would come at a terrible cost. Soldiers began to wonder if they were fighting for something as important as what the humans were fighting for. He took another drink, his voice becoming quieter. On the 10th day, we broke through the outer defenses and began our approach to Earth itself. That blue and green world, so small and fragile looking, surrounded by the burning wreckage of both fleets. You must have felt victorious. We felt empty, Zethkar said. We had won, but at such a cost. Half our fleet was gone, thousands of our best soldiers were dead, and the humans were still fighting, still broadcasting that same message, still refusing to surrender even with their homeworld under attack. What happened when you reached Earth? Zethkar was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. We saw something that broke our will to fight, he said. The planet's surface was covered with lights. Not city lights or military installations, but small lights scattered across every continent. Millions and millions of tiny lights. What were they? Candles, Zethkar said. The human population had lit candles and placed them in their windows. Every home, every building, every street corner, covered in candlelight. Even as our ships filled their sky, even as they faced certain defeat, they lit candles for their defenders. Lyra felt tears forming in her eyes. Our sensors picked up broadcasts from the planet's surface. Zethkar continued. Not military communications, but something else. Families singing together, children saying prayers for the soldiers fighting above them, parents telling stories to calm their frightened babies. They weren't panicking? Some were, Zethkar admitted. But most were doing something much more powerful. They were living. Even in the face of destruction, they were choosing to spend their final hours loving each other, taking care of each other, being human. He finished his drink and set the glass down with shaking hands. That was when Coalition Command realized the truth. He said, we could destroy every human ship. We could bomb every human city. We could kill every human soldier. But we could never truly defeat them, because they were not fighting for territory or resources or political systems. What were they fighting for? The right to light candles with their children, Zethkar said simply. The right to sing songs together during dark times. The right to tell stories and share meals and love each other without fear, things so simple and basic that we had forgotten they were worth fighting for. So you surrendered? We withdrew, Zethkar corrected. On the 14th day, Coalition Command ordered a full retreat. Officially, it was called a strategic redeployment. Unofficially, everyone knew the truth. We had won the battle, but we could not win the war. Not against an enemy that would never stop fighting for the right to be human. Zethkar looked directly at Lyra, his mechanical eyes glowing softly in the dim light. 6 months later, the Coalition sued for peace, he said. Not because we could not defeat human military forces, but because we finally understood what we would have to become to do so. And that price was too high for any civilized species to pay. The cantina seemed to hold its breath around them. That is why veterans like me drink alone, Zethkar said. Because we saw something beautiful and terrible in that battle. We saw what happens when people fight not for conquest or glory, but for love. And once you have seen that, everything else seems small and meaningless in comparison. Lyra sat in stunned silence as Zethkar finished his third story. The cantina around them seemed different now, quieter and more serious. Even the usual sounds of alien conversations and clinking glasses felt muted. I need another drink, Lyra said finally, her voice shaky. Zethkar gestured to the bartender with one of his forearms. When their drinks arrived, they sat without speaking for several minutes. Lyra stared at her glass while trying to process everything she had heard. These stories, she said eventually, are they true? Every word, Zethkar replied. And they are not the only ones. Veterans across the galaxy have similar tales. Battles where humans did impossible things. Defeats that somehow felt like victories. Encounters that changed the way we think about war itself. Why hasn't anyone heard about this before? Zethkar's mechanical eyes dimmed slightly. Because the coalition government classified all of it. Not to hide our military failures, but to prevent panic among our own populations. Panic about what? About what humans really are, Zethkar said quietly. The official story is that the war ended because both sides grew tired of fighting. A mutual decision to seek peace. But that is not the truth. What is the truth? Zethkar leaned forward, his voice dropping to a whisper. The truth is that we surrendered because we finally understood what we were fighting against. Not just human soldiers or human ships or human weapons. We were fighting against something much more dangerous. Which was hope, Zethkar said simply. Human hope. The absolute, unshakable belief that their children deserve a better future. That love is worth any sacrifice. That freedom is worth any price. He picked up his drink but did not sip it. Other species fight for things they can lose, he continued. Territory can be traded away. Resources can be shared. Honor can be restored. But humans fight for things that cannot be compromised. The right to protect their families. The right to choose their own path. The right to love without fear. You make them sound almost supernatural. Not supernatural, Zethkar corrected. Just human. But being human, it turns out, is more powerful than we ever imagined. Lyra shook her head slowly. I still don't understand how 12 people could empty a ship with 3,000 soldiers. Or how candlelight could end a war. Because you are thinking like a military strategist, Zethkar said. You are looking for weapons and tactics and battlefield advantages. But humans do not fight with weapons alone. They fight with something much more powerful. What? Truth, Zethkar said. They fight with the truth of what they are protecting. And when you show people that truth, when you help them see the real cost of war, the real value of peace, the real beauty of life, it becomes very hard to keep fighting. He finally took a sip of his drink. The 12 humans on the Eternal Glory did not use mind control or propaganda, he explained. They simply helped our soldiers remember what they were fighting for. And when those soldiers really thought about it, they realized their reasons were not as important as human reasons. You're saying humans are better than other species? No, Zethkar said firmly. I am saying humans fight for better reasons. They fight for each other, for their children, for the future. Most species fight for power or territory or revenge. These are selfish reasons. Human reasons are bigger. Lyra was quiet for a moment, thinking. What happened after the war? She asked. Officially, peace treaties were signed. Trade agreements were negotiated. Diplomatic relations were established. Everything very proper and civilized. And unofficially, Zethkar's voice grew softer. Unofficially, the galaxy changed. Veterans like me spread the stories I have told you. Not as official reports, but as warnings passed between old soldiers. Word spread about what humans were really capable of. Which was making us care, Zethkar said. Making us question what we were fighting for. Making us realize that some things are more important than victory. He looked around the cantina again as if checking for listeners. Do you know why this place is so quiet tonight? He asked. Why other patrons keep looking away when they see us talking? Lyra glanced around and realized he was right. The usual loud conversations and laughter of the cantina had died down to nervous murmurs. Because they recognize me, Zethkar continued. They know I am a veteran of the human war. And that makes them uncomfortable. Why? Because they know the stories. Maybe not the details, but they know that something happened during that war. Something that changed the way we think about humans. Something that made even the bravest warriors afraid. Afraid of humans? Afraid of becoming their enemy, Zethkar corrected. Because we learned that fighting humans means fighting people who will never give up, never compromise, never accept defeat. People who will die for strangers they have never met, for children not yet born, for ideals that cannot be touched or measured. He finished his drink and set it down carefully. The galaxy learned to fear human combat, he said, not because they are the strongest or the smartest or the most advanced, but because when they fight, they carry the weight of everyone they are protecting, and that makes them unstoppable. So humans won the war? Humans saved the war, Zethkar said. They saved it from becoming something evil and endless. They showed us that war should have limits, that victory should have meaning, that peace is worth more than pride. Lyra felt overwhelmed by everything she had heard. What should I do with these stories? She asked. Zethkar considered the question carefully. Write them down, he said finally, but write them carefully. Do not make humans sound like perfect beings or unstoppable warriors. They are not gods or monsters. They are just people who love their families very much. But people should know the truth. Some truth, yes, Zethkar agreed. Let people know that humans fight differently. Let them know that human determination comes from love, not hatred. Let them know that peace with humans is not just possible but necessary. And the rest? The rest you keep to yourself, Zethkar said. Some truths are too frightening for people who have never faced them. The full extent of what humans will do to protect each other, that knowledge is a burden better carried by those who have seen it firsthand. He stood up slowly, his forearms moving carefully to avoid bumping the table. I have told you these stories for a reason, he said, not to frighten you but to help you understand. Humans are our neighbors now, our trading partners, our allies. They live among us, work with us, share the galaxy with us, and that's good. That is wonderful, Zethkar said. And for the first time that evening, his voice held warmth. Because humans who are fighting for their families will do anything to win. But humans who are protecting their families while living in peace, they will do anything to keep that peace. He looked down at Lyra one last time. Remember this above all else, he said. Humans fight because they love, not because they hate. And a species that fights for love will always find a way to choose peace. If peace is offered honestly. With that, he walked away, leaving Lyra alone at the table with her recorder, her notes, and the weight of secrets that would change how the galaxy saw humanity forever. She sat there for a long time, watching other patrons give nervous glances toward the empty chair where Zethkar had been sitting. Finally, she gathered her things and prepared to leave, knowing that she would never look at humans the same way again. The stories would be written, but carefully. The truth would be told, but gently. Because some revelations are too powerful to share all at once, and some legends are better left as mysteries that keep the peace. Outside the cantina, ships from a dozen different worlds moved through the space lanes around Nexus Prime. Human ships traveled among them, small and unremarkable, carrying families and traders and tourists. They looked harmless enough, but now Lyra knew better. Now she understood what those ships really carried, the most dangerous force in the galaxy. Not weapons or warriors, but people who would do absolutely anything to protect each other. And somehow that knowledge made the galaxy feel both more frightening and more hopeful than it ever had before.